When a weary single mother is ignored by a waiter who assumes she won't tip, the encounter seems insignificant, until she returns as his new boss. As their paths cross again, the waiter must confront his own biases and regrets. But is it too late for redemption, or will karma find a way to balance the scales? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Grace could feel her feet dragging as she approached the entrance to the restaurant. Her children, Jacob and Emily, were walking alongside her, each holding on to her hands. Jacob, always brimming with curiosity, had spent the entire car ride asking questions about the stars and planets, while Emily had quietly hummed her favorite tune. It had been a long day for Grace. Work, school pickups, errands, and then a quick dash to the grocery store. But the kids deserved a treat. Tonight, they were going to eat out, something Grace allowed herself to splurge on once in a while. The restaurant was busy, with a steady hum of chatter filling the air. Grace took a moment to adjust her bag, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face, and gently guided her children toward an empty booth near the back. She always chose the back, less chance of judgmental stares when the kids grew too loud or fidgety. Not that they misbehaved, but Grace knew how people could be. A single mother dining with her kids wasn't always the most welcome sight, and she'd had her fair share of looks that made her feel like she didn't belong. Thomas, meanwhile, had just finished a shift-long marathon of orders, complaints, and hurried service. His feet ached, and his patience was running thin. It was nearing the end of the dinner rush, but new tables kept filling up. He let out a breath when he saw the new arrivals, a woman with 2 kids, both bright-eyed and full of energy. His first thought was how long this table would take. In his experience, families with small kids meant extra work. Special requests, spilled drinks, and a mess to clean up afterward. He'd seen it too many times, and, more often than not, the tip wouldn't reflect the effort. Grace smiled at Thomas when he approached, her eyes warm despite the exhaustion she was trying to hide. She spoke with a soft tone, her politeness unshakable even as she noticed the slight frown on his face. She had grown used to these small moments, the micro-expressions that spoke volumes. Thomas didn't make any effort to hide his indifference as he scribbled down their drink orders. No specials mentioned, no suggestions, no friendly banter, just the bare minimum. "What would you like to order for the kids?" he asked. His voice clipped, already looking at the table behind them. "We'll have the grilled chicken for them, with some mashed potatoes, please," Grace said, still trying to maintain her warmth. She wasn't expecting much, but the disinterest still stung. As the evening progressed, the subtle neglect became more apparent. Thomas returned with their drinks, but never checked to see if they needed refills. He hurriedly placed their food on the table, not stopping to ask if everything looked okay. Grace noticed that other tables received more attention, especially those that seemed to fit his idea of good customers. Groups of well-dressed professionals, couples on dates, older patrons who might leave larger tips, all got more of his time. Grace took a deep breath. This wasn't a new experience for her, but each time it chipped away at her spirit a little more. People always made assumptions. She was tired, worn out, a single mother struggling to keep it together. She could see it in the way they glanced at her, the way their eyes swept over her faded clothes, or the way they whispered among themselves when they thought she wasn't looking. What they didn't know was how hard she worked, how she juggled her job and parenthood, how she was saving up for a better future for her children, and how she had dreams that extended beyond the limits of people's judgments. Despite the lack of attention from Thomas, Grace made sure to create a pleasant dinner for her children. She cut their chicken into bite-sized pieces, engaged them in conversation, and laughed when Jacob made silly faces at Emily. Her children were her joy, and in moments like this, she reminded herself that their happiness was all that mattered. It was easy to lose sight of that when the world seemed determined to reduce her to a stereotype. When the check finally came, Grace glanced at the total and reached for her wallet. Her first instinct was to leave the exact amount and walk out. Thomas hadn't earned a tip. He had barely looked at her, and when he did, it was with a dismissive glance that made her feel small. But then, as she fished out her money, she paused. Grace believed in karma, in the idea that kindness, no matter how difficult to muster, would come back around. She didn't want to teach her children bitterness. She wanted them to know that grace, her namesake, was something you extended even when people didn't deserve it. So she left a generous tip, far more than Thomas had earned that night. She carefully placed the money under the bill, stood up, and helped her children gather their things. As they walked toward the door, Grace didn't look back. She had learned long ago that seeking validation from people like Thomas only led to disappointment. Thomas, busy with another table, didn't notice the tip right away. When he did finally clear their table, he saw the neatly folded bill and paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. His assumption had been wrong, but instead of feeling grateful, he dismissed it with a shrug. He had bigger things to worry about. Rumors about a new manager coming in, talk of changes in the restaurant. He pushed Grace and her children from his mind as easily as he had dismissed them when they first walked in. Grace, meanwhile, drove home with her children, her thoughts drifting between fatigue and determination. She had a plan, a vision for her life that went beyond these small moments of indignity. Tonight was just another chapter in her story, and she was determined to write a better ending for herself and her kids. As she tucked Jacob and Emily into bed that night, Grace kissed them on the forehead and whispered, "We're going to be just fine." Little did she know just how soon life would take an unexpected turn, and how the waiter who had overlooked her would soon be looking up to her in ways he never could have imagined. Thomas leaned against the counter, wiping his brow as the dinner rush finally began to taper off. His co-workers were busy clearing tables and chatting about the day, but he kept mostly to himself. The day had felt longer than usual, and that table with the single mother and her 2 kids still lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't quite put his finger on why. It wasn't like she had complained or caused a scene. In fact, she had been the exact opposite, polite, quiet, and calm despite having 2 young children with her. Yet, there was something about her that had rubbed him the wrong way. He chalked it up to his own exhaustion. After all, working long hours at the restaurant could wear anyone down. Still, he found himself replaying the encounter in his mind. What had been so off about it? Maybe it was just that, in his line of work, he had grown used to judging people quickly. It was a survival tactic, a way to manage his energy. Some people were worth the effort. Those who looked like they could afford a good meal, who dressed nicely and carried themselves with confidence. Others, well, he assumed they wouldn't appreciate good service, even if they got it. Grace and her children had fallen into the latter category in his mind. He hadn't meant to be rude, he had just gone through the motions. As a result, he had given them less than his best, but it wasn't like she had said anything. In fact, when he thought about it, the mother had seemed tired, perhaps, but certainly not ungrateful. She had smiled, been polite. And then there was that tip, far more than he expected, and certainly more than he felt he deserved. That had been the strangest part. "Man, you're quiet tonight," said Jason, one of the other waiters, as he approached Thomas at the counter. "What's up?" "Just thinking," Thomas replied, shrugging. "Had a long day." "Yeah, tell me about it. That family you had earlier with the 2 kids, how'd that go? Seemed like they might be a handful." Thomas grimaced. "Honestly, not bad. The kids were fine, but I didn't expect much from them, you know? Figured they wouldn't tip well, so I didn't exactly go out of my way." Jason raised an eyebrow. "But they did tip well, right? I saw the bill when you cleared it." "You must have done something right." Thomas shook his head. "That's the thing. I didn't. I barely talked to them, didn't even check on them once. But she still left way more than I thought she would. Doesn't make sense." Jason leaned back, crossing his arms. "Maybe she's just one of those people. You know, doesn't care how she's treated, just leaves the tip anyway. Or maybe she's used to it, single mom and all. I bet she deals with that kind of stuff a lot." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know, people judging her, assuming she's not worth their time. Happens all the time with people like that. I've seen it a lot. A mom with 2 kids comes in alone and people assume she can't afford to tip well or that she's going to make a mess. It's kind of messed up, honestly." Thomas hadn't really thought about it that way before. Sure, he'd made assumptions, but so did everyone else. That was part of the job, wasn't it? You had to size people up, figure out how to serve them based on what you thought they were going to give back in return. It wasn't personal, it was just practical. Still, something about Jason's comment stuck with him. Had he really judged Grace that harshly without even realizing it? The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. He had been doing this job for years, and he had his own set of rules about who deserved what kind of service. But now, reflecting on it, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Maybe his assumptions weren't as practical as he thought. Maybe they were just prejudices. Anyway, Jason said, snapping him out of his thoughts, I heard we've got a new manager starting soon. Apparently she's from corporate and she's supposed to be tough but fair. Heard anything? Thomas shook his head, trying to focus on the new topic. Nope, not really sure what to expect, but I'm hoping she's not one of those micromanagers. We've got enough stress around here already. Jason laughed. Yeah, right? I just hope she's not one of those types who comes in and starts changing everything right away. I hate when new managers think they have to reinvent the wheel. The conversation drifted back into mundane work chatter, but Thomas's mind was still buzzing. The idea that he might have treated Grace unfairly didn't sit well with him. He wasn't a bad person, at least he didn't think so. But he couldn't deny that he had made an assumption about her the moment she walked in. He hadn't even considered giving her a chance. Days passed, and the restaurant carried on as usual. Thomas slipped back into his routine, though Grace's visit continued to float in the back of his mind. He tried not to think about it too much, but every time he served a table with young children or a family that didn't quite fit his idea of a good tipper, he caught himself hesitating. He began to question his own instincts, unsure if he was really seeing people for who they were, or just who he thought they should be. Then came the day that the new manager was set to arrive. The staff had been buzzing about it for days, and tension hung in the air. Thomas had been at the restaurant long enough to know that management changes often brought a lot of unnecessary stress. Some new managers liked to make sweeping changes right away, whether they were needed or not. It wasn't exactly something he was looking forward to. He was in the middle of cleaning a table when he heard the door to the manager's office open. The restaurant wasn't very large, and the office was tucked away in a corner near the kitchen, so when the door creaked open, it drew his attention immediately. He glanced up, wiping his hands on his apron, and then he froze. Standing in the doorway, speaking with the general manager, was Grace. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, wondering if he was seeing things wrong, but there was no mistake. It was her, the same woman he had served just days before. The same woman he had brushed off with barely a second thought. His stomach twisted into knots. Grace was the new manager. A wave of cold panic washed over him. Had she recognized him? Did she remember the way he had treated her? Was this going to be some kind of karmic payback? But as he stood there, watching from a distance, Grace didn't so much as glance in his direction. She seemed composed and professional, entirely focused on her conversation with the general manager. She was smiling, but it was a different kind of smile than the one she had given him when he served her. This one was confident, self-assured. It was clear that she was here in a position of authority, and whatever assumptions Thomas had made about her before were crumbling before his eyes. He turned back to the table he was cleaning, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped down the surface. This was going to be interesting, to say the least. The shift in the restaurant's atmosphere was palpable the moment Grace officially stepped into her role as manager. From day one, she brought a quiet confidence that immediately caught the attention of the staff. There was no grand announcement, no speech about sweeping changes or new policies. Instead, Grace took the time to observe. She greeted everyone with a kind but firm demeanor, making sure to introduce herself and listen to how the restaurant operated from their perspective. For most of the employees, her presence was refreshing. She wasn't the type to bark orders or make demands without understanding the dynamics of the place. She asked thoughtful questions about workflows, listened to the concerns of the kitchen staff, and made it clear that her goal was to help the restaurant run more smoothly, not to overhaul it for the sake of change. In just a few days, she had already made a positive impression on almost everyone. Almost everyone. Thomas, on the other hand, was living in a state of barely contained anxiety. Each day since Grace had arrived, he'd been waiting for the moment when she would call him out. The memory of how he had treated her during her visit as a customer gnawed at him relentlessly. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting there with her kids, her quiet smile as he neglected their table. Every time Grace passed by him in the restaurant, he felt a wave of panic surge through his chest. But Grace never mentioned it. Not once. It was this very silence that unnerved him the most. She treated him with the same professionalism she extended to everyone else. Polite greetings, clear instructions, no hint of personal resentment. If she remembered that night, and Thomas was sure she did, she wasn't showing it. Her restraint, her grace, only made him feel worse. How was she not angry? How had she not pulled him into her office to reprimand him, or worse, fire him outright? Instead, Grace spent her days making subtle but effective changes around the restaurant. She reorganized shifts to ensure that the busiest times were staffed properly, smoothing out the chaotic peaks and valleys in the workday. She introduced small training sessions that improved efficiency and customer service, ensuring that every waiter and waitress knew how to engage customers with care and attention. She even spent time in the kitchen, learning from the cooks, respecting their process, and suggesting improvements only where necessary. The restaurant quickly began to thrive under her leadership. Regular customers started noticing the changes. Everything seemed to run more smoothly, and the staff appeared more relaxed, less frantic. The energy shifted, and positive reviews started pouring in. But none of this eased Thomas's discomfort. Every time Grace made a suggestion or gave him feedback, he couldn't help but feel like there was an underlying message he was missing. Was she subtly punishing him? Or was she genuinely trying to help him become a better waiter, with no ulterior motive? The uncertainty gnawed at him, day and night. His sleep started to suffer. He found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying their interactions in his head. He hated the idea that she might be silently judging him, that she had a story in her mind about who he was based on that one bad night. A part of him wanted to explain himself, to apologize, but another part of him, the more stubborn part, kept telling him to let it go. After all, she hadn't brought it up, so why should he? Weeks passed, and Thomas's anxiety only grew. He noticed that Grace was paying attention to the small details in everyone's work, including his. Her feedback was always constructive, never accusatory, but it started to feel personal. She mentioned things he had never even thought about before. How he approached tables, how often he refilled drinks, how he handled customer complaints. It was all done in the name of improvement. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that she was testing him. One particularly busy evening, Thomas's nerves got the best of him. The restaurant was packed, and he was moving from table to table, trying to keep up with the orders and demands. He could feel Grace's eyes on him as she moved through the restaurant, quietly helping where she could and keeping everything running smoothly. His heart pounded in his chest every time she came near, and by the time he got to his last table of the night, he was on edge. The family at the table had 2 young children, just like Grace had that night. They were fidgeting in their seats, and the parents looked tired, the same weary expressions he had seen on Grace's face weeks ago. Thomas approached them with a strained smile, trying to push down his anxiety. "What can I get for you folks?" he asked, his voice tight. The mother smiled warmly, despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "We'll start with water, please, and maybe a kid's menu for the little ones." Thomas scribbled down the order quickly and hurried back to the kitchen. His heart was racing. It felt like déjà vu, and all he could think about was that night with Grace. He had made a mistake then, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make another one. When he returned to the table with the drinks, the kids were getting restless. One of them knocked over a glass of water, spilling it across the table. Thomas froze, staring at the spreading puddle. "I'm so sorry," the mother said, her face flushing with embarrassment as she tried to clean up the mess with napkins. "They've had a long day." "It's fine," Thomas muttered, but his voice was clipped. He turned on his heel to grab a cloth, feeling his frustration building. Why couldn't they just keep things neat? Why was it always the families that made things harder? As he was mopping up the water, he felt a presence behind him. He looked up to see Grace standing there, her expression calm but knowing. She handed him another cloth, her eyes soft. "Here, let me help," she said gently. Thomas's stomach twisted. She was watching him again, just like that night. Was this her way of reminding him? Was she waiting for him to mess up? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Thomas couldn't focus. He felt like he was under a microscope, and every small mistake was magnified. By the time his shift ended, he was exhausted, not just physically but mentally. He slumped into a chair in the staff break room, rubbing his temples. "Rough night?" Thomas looked up to see Grace standing in the doorway. She had a soft smile on her face, the kind that made it hard to tell if she was genuinely concerned or if she was about to lecture him. "Yeah," Thomas said, forcing a chuckle. "Busy, I guess." Grace stepped into the room and sat down across from him. "I've noticed you've been a bit off lately. Is everything okay?" Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. She was going to bring up that night. He could feel the words hanging in the air between them. But Grace didn't mention it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes full of genuine concern. "I want to help you," she said softly. "I know this job can be overwhelming, especially when things get hectic. But you're a good waiter, Thomas. You care about your work. I can see that. I just think, maybe, you're holding yourself back." Thomas blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Grace smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Sometimes we get stuck in our own heads thinking we know how things are going to go before they even happen. We make assumptions about people, about situations. But the truth is, we don't know what's really going on unless we take the time to see it." Thomas's throat tightened. She wasn't just talking about the job. She was talking about him, about that night, about everything he had been feeling since she arrived. "You have a lot of potential," Grace continued. "But you need to give yourself and others a little more credit." Thomas nodded, unable to find the words. His guilt was gnawing at him, but Grace's kindness, her ability to look past his mistakes, was overwhelming. He felt something shift inside him, a realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong in more ways than one. As Grace stood up to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Think about it," she said softly. "You're capable of more than you realize." And with that, she left the room, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. The days after Grace's quiet words of encouragement were some of the longest Thomas had ever experienced. Every time he clocked in for a shift, he felt a mix of dread and determination gnawing at him. Grace's words echoed in his head. "You need to give yourself and others a little more credit." It wasn't just a casual remark. It had a depth he wasn't ready for, and it continued to weigh on his mind. Thomas knew he had to change. He had been going through the motions at the restaurant, letting his assumptions guide his interactions with customers, coworkers, and even his own perception of his abilities. It wasn't just about that night with Grace, though it had triggered something inside him. It was about years of working on autopilot, years of brushing off people he thought wouldn't matter, wouldn't tip, or wouldn't appreciate the effort. Now, he was beginning to realize just how narrow his vision had become. One evening, about a week after their conversation in the break room, Thomas found himself serving a table that stirred the old habits he was trying to shed. A family, 2 parents and 3 kids, all under the age of 10, had come in, clearly worn from a long day. The kids were bickering about something, and the parents were trying their best to keep them calm, though exhaustion hung over their faces. Thomas could feel his usual assumptions bubbling up, the instinct to treat the table with a kind of detached, efficient disinterest. "They'll be noisy, messy, and probably not tip well," his old thoughts whispered. But then he remembered Grace's words, and he pushed the negativity aside. Taking a deep breath, he approached the table with a smile that felt more genuine than it had in a long time. "How's everyone doing tonight?" he asked, his tone warm. The mother looked up, clearly surprised by the kind greeting. "We're good, thanks. It's been a long day, though." "I can imagine," Thomas replied. "Kids keeping you busy?" The father chuckled softly, nodding. "You could say that." Thomas leaned down slightly, bringing himself closer to the kids' level. "I bet you guys are hungry. What do you think?" Got any favorite dishes here?" The kids perked up, one of them eagerly pointing at the menu and declaring their love for chicken tenders. The parents exchanged relieved glances, and for the first time since sitting down, they seemed to relax. Over the course of the meal, Thomas made a conscious effort to engage with the family in a way he hadn't before. He didn't hover, but he checked in enough to make sure their experience was smooth, refilling their drinks before they had to ask, bringing extra napkins when he saw the youngest spill his water, and even suggesting a dessert when he noticed the kids had finished their meals without too much fuss. When they left, the mother gave him a tired but sincere smile. "Thank you for being so kind. It's not easy eating out with 3 kids, but you made it a lot easier tonight." Thomas felt a warmth he hadn't expected, and when he went to clear their table, he found a tip far more generous than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the money, it was the realization that for the first time in a long time, he had served with intention, with kindness, not with judgment, and it had made a difference. Grace watched Thomas's shift in attitude over the following weeks with quiet satisfaction. She had seen the potential in him from the beginning, even before their encounter as strangers. When she had sat in the restaurant with her children that night, she had been aware of Thomas's indifferent behavior, the assumptions he made about her simply based on her appearance and circumstances. But she had also seen something else in him. A kind of weariness that suggested he wasn't a bad person, just someone who had lost his way. Now, watching him grow into his role with more purpose, Grace knew she had been right not to confront him directly about that night. He wasn't the kind of person who needed a lecture. He needed the opportunity to reflect on his own choices and come to terms with them. Grace believed in leading by example, in showing people the power of forgiveness and second chances without rubbing their mistakes in their faces. One afternoon, as the restaurant was transitioning between the lunch and dinner rush, Grace found herself in the office going over the weekly schedule. Thomas's name popped up, and she paused for a moment, considering how far he had come in such a short time. It wasn't easy to change one's perspective, especially when it involved recognizing prejudices you didn't even realize you had. But Thomas was doing it. He was becoming the kind of waiter and the kind of person she knew he could be. She decided to check in on him. Stepping out of the office, she spotted Thomas at the far end of the dining area, clearing a table with a calm efficiency that she admired. When he noticed her approaching, he stood up straight, wiping his hands on his apron. "Hey, Grace," he said, his voice less tense than it had been in the past. He was starting to get used to her presence. "How's everything going today?" she asked, her tone casual. "Pretty good, actually," Thomas replied. He gestured toward the dining area, which was mostly empty at the moment. "It's been quiet, but I'm not complaining." Grace smiled. "That's good to hear. I've noticed you've been more engaged with the customers lately. It's really made a difference." Thomas shifted slightly, a hint of pride and discomfort creeping into his expression. "Thanks. I've been trying to change a bit. Not make so many assumptions." Grace nodded, sensing the hesitation in his voice. "It's not easy, is it?" "No," Thomas admitted. "I guess I didn't realize how much I was doing it, but I've been thinking about what you said, about giving people more credit, and, well, I think you were right." There was a vulnerability in his words that Grace hadn't expected, and it softened her even more. She could see that this wasn't just about being a better waiter for Thomas. It was about being a better person, about recognizing that his own assumptions and biases had been holding him back in more ways than one. "Growth isn't a straight line," Grace said gently. "It's a lot of little steps, but the fact that you're even thinking about it is a huge step in itself." Thomas looked down at the table he had just cleared, his brow furrowing slightly. "I don't know. I keep thinking about that night. When you were here with your kids, I was so focused on my assumptions that I didn't even see you." Grace's heart clenched. She had known this moment might come, the moment when Thomas would bring up their first encounter. She had chosen not to confront him about it, but now here he was, facing it head on. "You didn't have to bring that up," Grace said softly, her voice calm. "I do, though," Thomas replied, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "I treated you unfairly. I didn't give you the service you deserved, and I judged you before I even knew anything about you. I'm sorry." Grace let the words hang in the air for a moment, absorbing the sincerity in his apology. She could see how much it had taken for him to say it, to acknowledge his mistake so openly. "I forgive you," she said simply, and the relief in Thomas's eyes was immediate. "But," she continued, "it's not about me forgiving you, it's about you forgiving yourself. We all make mistakes, Thomas. What matters is that we learn from them. And from what I've seen, you're doing just that." Thomas nodded, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like weeks. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying the weight of that night, the guilt of treating someone so poorly based on his own misguided assumptions. But now, with Grace's forgiveness, and more importantly, her belief in his ability to change, he felt lighter. As Grace turned to walk away, Thomas called out to her, "Grace?" She looked back, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah? Thanks for giving me a second chance, not just at the job but, at everything." Grace smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across her face. "You earned it, Thomas. Keep it up." With that, she walked away, leaving Thomas standing in the empty dining area, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Months had passed since Grace had become the manager, and the changes in both the restaurant and Thomas were undeniable. The restaurant had blossomed under Grace's leadership. Customers frequently commented on the improved service, the atmosphere felt more relaxed, and the employees were thriving. Grace's empathetic yet firm style had fostered a sense of camaraderie among the staff, and there was a noticeable boost in morale. Even during the busiest nights, the tension that used to hang over the restaurant had dissipated. Thomas, once the epitome of jaded indifference, had transformed in ways he never thought possible. His initial fear and guilt over how he had treated Grace had shifted into something more profound: gratitude. He had grown to respect her not just as a manager, but as a person who embodied patience, strength, and grace in the truest sense. She had given him a second chance without ever directly confronting him about his mistakes, and he had taken that gift seriously. Every shift now felt like an opportunity to prove, to himself, to his coworkers, and even to Grace, that he had learned from his past. He went out of his way to treat every customer with care, whether they looked like they were high tippers or not. Thomas no longer rushed through tables or made snap judgments. In fact, he found joy in connecting with people, hearing their stories, and understanding the small intricacies of their lives. Grace had noticed the change, and though she hadn't said much, the subtle nods of approval and encouraging smiles she gave him as they crossed paths in the restaurant were enough to let Thomas know that he was on the right track. He had come to appreciate those moments, small but meaningful gestures that reminded him of how far he had come. But one evening, a moment arrived that tested everything Thomas had learned about himself. It was a Friday night, one of the busiest nights of the week. The restaurant was buzzing with the clinking of cutlery, bursts of laughter from groups of friends, and the steady hum of conversation. Thomas had just finished serving a table when Grace approached him with a request. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady but kind, "can you help out with table 7? Thomas glanced over at the table and felt his chest tighten. Seated there was a single mother with 2 young children. The resemblance to the night he had first encountered Grace was uncanny. The mother looked tired, her children restless, and there was an unmistakable air of exhaustion that hung over the family. It was like looking at a mirror of his past mistake. He swallowed hard. Grace, standing beside him, seemed to read the hesitation on his face. But she didn't say anything. She just waited, her expression neutral but knowing. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've got it." As he approached the table, memories of that night with Grace rushed back. The dismissive way he had treated her, the assumptions he had made, and the guilt that had followed him for months. This time, though, something was different. He wasn't the same person who had let his biases dictate his behavior. He greeted the mother with a genuine smile, crouching slightly so he could speak to her and the children at eye level. "How are you all doing tonight?" he asked, his tone warm and inviting. The mother looked up, startled by his kindness. We're okay, just a little tired. It's been a long day," she said, her voice laced with fatigue. "I completely understand." Thomas said, nodding sympathetically. Don't worry, we'll take good care of you tonight. Is there anything I can get for the kids right away? Maybe some juice or something to keep them going? The children, who had been fidgeting, perked up at the mention of juice, and the mother smiled, relief washing over her face. That would be great, thank you. Thomas went out of his way to ensure their experience was smooth and pleasant. He checked on them regularly, made sure the kids had extra napkins, and even brought out their meals a little faster than usual. The mother's expression softened with every interaction, and by the time the meal was over, Thomas could see the visible shift in her demeanor. She was no longer carrying the weight of judgment or stress. Instead, she seemed at ease, her children happy and well-fed. When it came time for the check, the mother hesitated. She glanced at the bill, then at Thomas, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. I just want to thank you, she said finally, her voice quiet but sincere. I don't get to go out to eat with my kids often, and it's not always easy, but you made it feel nice, like we were welcome here. Thomas's heart swelled. He smiled and shook his head gently. You don't have to thank me. It was my pleasure. The mother nodded, her eyes misting slightly as she tucked a few bills under the check and gathered her children. As they left, Thomas glanced at the tip and felt a wave of humility wash over him. It wasn't just the money, it was the realization that he had made a difference. He had done what he couldn't do that night with Grace. He had treated this woman and her children with the respect and kindness they deserved, without letting his old assumptions get in the way. When he turned back to the restaurant, he found Grace standing nearby, watching him with that same quiet smile she always gave him. How did it go? She asked, though her eyes already held the answer. Thomas took a deep breath, a small smile playing on his lips. It went well, I think I finally got it. Grace's smile deepened, and she stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. I knew you would. The warmth of her words settled over him like a blanket, comforting and reassuring. He realized then that Grace had always seen something in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. She had given him the space to grow, to make mistakes, and to find his own way back. And now, he had come full circle. Months later, as the restaurant continued to thrive, Thomas and Grace's relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect and understanding. They rarely spoke about that night anymore, but it didn't need to be discussed. The growth, the redemption, and the silent forgiveness had already played out in their actions. One evening, long after the dinner rush had ended, Thomas found himself sitting with Grace in the now quiet restaurant, reflecting on the journey they had both been on. The soft glow of the overhead lights cast a warm hue across the room, and the faint sounds of laughter from the kitchen staff finishing up their work created a peaceful backdrop. You know, Grace began, breaking the comfortable silence, this place has changed a lot, and so have you. Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Yeah, I guess I have, Grace smiled. It's funny how life works sometimes. You never know who's going to walk into your life and change it. Thomas chuckled softly. Or who you're going to serve a bad meal to. They both laughed, the tension that had once existed between them long gone, replaced by something deeper, an understanding that life had a way of teaching lessons in the most unexpected ways. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Karma has a way of balancing things out, doesn't it? Thomas nodded again, his heart full. Yeah, I guess it does. In the end, it wasn't about the mistakes they had made or the assumptions they had once held. It was about what they had learned from them. Grace had taught him about grace, about giving people a chance to be better than their worst moments. And in return, Thomas had learned to see beyond the surface, to understand that everyone had a story, everyone had a struggle, and it wasn't his place to judge. As the restaurant lights dimmed and the staff began to leave for the night, Thomas realized that he had come to love this place, not just because of the work, but because of the people. Because of Grace. She had shown him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and being better because of it. And in the quiet of the closing restaurant, Thomas smiled, knowing that he had found not just a second chance, but a new beginning. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.